This is an OS Giken Super Lock limited slip differential that we picked up from Counterspace Garage, and this here is the final part I need to optimize the preparation for my BRZ. The OS Giken unit is an aftermarket differential meant to replace the stock Torsen differential that is in the BRZ FRS and 86 from the factory. This one will improve rear grip when on the power or exiting corners, those kind of scenarios, giving you more traction, more speed, and hopefully faster times. And check this out, guys, if you want to save a little bit of money when shopping at Counterspace Garage, enter the code JustinsPitLane15 during checkout. Save yourself a little bit of cash on tested and proven parts. Now we're going to go ahead and get this OS Giken unit installed on my BRZ. So swapping out the differential on your car is not a simple task. It takes a good bit of time. You got to take a lot of things apart. We have to disconnect the drive shaft on the car. We have to remove the axles. We have to drain the differential fluid. We have to drop the entire differential housing out of the car. Then we have to take it apart so we can put the OS Giken unit that we have here inside the differential housing, replacing that stock Torsen differential like we mentioned. Then we got to put everything back together, fill the differential back with fluid, and get it back on the road. So we have a lot of work to do. We're gonna go ahead and get this thing up in the air and get cranking. You will need an assortment of basic tools for this job, including a 19mm and 17mm wrench, a small pry bar, and an axle fork is a good thing to have. You'll also need some sockets, a 10mm Allen key for getting the differential drain bolt out, the associated ratchet wrenches and extensions, and that's really about all you need for this particular job. We'll quickly point out the things that you'll need to remove, starting with the drain plug on the differential, the two main upward bolts that hold the differential housing in place, your axles, of course, that will pop out, and then there are 3 bolts on the back side of the differential connected to the subframe. Towards the front of the differential is, of course, your drive shaft, and there are 4 nuts and bolts there, which we'll have to remove, so we'll get started. Alright, so the differential is out of the car. We have it up on the bench here. Everything went pretty smoothly. Nothing terribly difficult. It was a little bit difficult getting the nuts and bolts loosened up on the drive shaft under there. But once you got them loosened up, it came apart pretty easily. You just have to pry the drive shaft off of the face of the differential, and then lowering the differential down with the jack. Obviously, it helps to have a helper either lower the jack or be underneath the car helping guide the thing down, but it's not too bad. I've done this a number of times in the past. So the jack method, just lowering it down slowly, and then when it's about halfway down or so, you pull out the axles, and then those things come out pretty easily. And then after that, it's just lowering the differential down and getting it out from under the car. And now with the differential up on the bench here, we can start the fun part, which is tearing this thing apart and then getting the guts out of it, the old Torsen differential, and then getting our OS Giken differential installed into the differential pumpkin. There's 8 bolts on the back of the differential housing that you need to remove. I cracked them loose with a ratchet wrench and then used the impact driver to get them off the rest of the way. Once you get to this point, there are a few things you want to do. First, you want to clean off the gasket that is around the outside of the pumpkin here. You can use some towels or some Goo Gone. Even your fingernail, as you can see, kind of scrapes it away, but you want to get all of that stuff off so you have a nice clean surface. The other thing you need to do is remove or release these locking tabs on these metal pieces down here. This little bracket, as you can see right here, it has these little tabs around the bolts to keep them from loosening. What you need to do is get a screwdriver in there, pry it back so those things are flat and out of the way. That way you can get a wrench onto the bolt and we can loosen it up and take it out. That will allow us to get the ring gear, which is this big gear here, off of the differential, because we'll reuse that on the OS Giken unit. The other important thing you want to do is make sure that the two brackets on each side of the differential here, this one here is marked, this one here isn't. You want to make sure you mark these and put them on the appropriate side. So we're going to clean this up over here and put another one on this side of the housing so we know which side it goes on when we put things back together.
In order to get our differential out of the pumpkin housing, we want to use our little pry bar and sort of tap out the differential by leveraging a bolt or another hard area on the differential against the side of the pumpkin housing, and just sort of give it a little love tap and very slowly kind of squeeze it out of there. It will come out slowly, but just don't overdo it, and use small taps when you're using your pry bar, and eventually it will get close and then you can pull it out the rest of the way by hand.
Now that the differential is out of the housing, there's a couple things we want to do still with these two pieces. Obviously, we want to empty out all of the fluid from the case, get it all cleaned up and nice and shiny on the inside. Then we want to take our differential and we just have to pry the ring gear off of the diff. That's this big gear on the outside. And then we'll take that and actually put it on the OS Giken diff. Here we can take a close look at both of the differentials next to each other. I'm not going to go into specific details, but what you can notice, the difference between the OEM differential or the Torsen style differential, you'll notice it's packed with gears and different things on the inside. You can kind of see them in the holes there. It's an assortment of gears and different things like that that actually actuate the limited slip behavior of the differential. Now if we take a look at the OS Giken, this is a different design. There are no gears inside it. It's actually filled with various clutches, clutch packs, and conical or concave or convex washers. And that mechanism in the OS Giken is what allows it to perform its lockup for the limited slip. And despite the differences in the design, both of these differentials are made to do one thing, which is to keep the rear wheels or front wheels, if it's a front wheel drive car, spinning and providing traction when the car is cornering or exiting a corner trying to put down power. Now we get to go ahead and put the ring gear onto the OS Giken differential. Now if you remember when we took the stock differential apart, we had these little clips or retainers that were to keep those bolts in place. They go a little bit something like this, and then the tabs were clamped down. Well, we're not actually going to use these things. You can throw them aside, keep them if you need to put the differential back together with the OEM differential someday, like I probably will. But putting the ring gear on the OS Giken, all you need is the bolts, and I have a new set of bolts that I bought because they're nice and cheap. And then what we're going to do is put blue thread locker. Yes, this is blue thread locker despite it being a red tube. We're going to put the blue thread locker on all of the bolts, bring the ring gear up to the differential, and then bolt it all together. Alright, so now we have the ring gear secured onto the OS Giken diff. Now you noticed I broke out the impact driver on that step. Now I only did that just to very lightly snug the bolts to the ring gear, basically pull the ring gear up to the differential so that it is flush across the diff. We'll actually torque down those bolts later when the differential is back in the diff housing. It's easier to do versus on the table like this, because you try to turn a nut and the differential just spins around in circles. So just snug up the bolts with the impact driver. You don't have to go cranking the thing down full blast. But now we have the differential ready to go back into the diff housing.
Grab a helper to hold the pumpkin housing upright as shown in the video. We're going to throw the bearing races over the bearings on the differential, and then there are washers that fit into the side of the pumpkin housing that the bearing faces go up against. We're going to pick up the differential, lower it into the pumpkin housing, and be careful not to pinch your finger and get it stuck in there like I did. It kind of hurts just a little bit. Those differentials are heavy. With a little bit of finagling, you can get the differential lined up in there properly and start sliding it down into place. Give it a few pushes to get it down in there further, and then what we're going to do is grab some pieces of wood and a shop rag and very lightly tap with a rubber mallet on the bearing races to get the differential further down into position. Next, we'll grab the brackets that we marked earlier and place them over the bearing races on the left and the right side, and then proceed to secure those down, of course, putting Loctite on the bolts in the process. Have a helper stick a screwdriver through the drive shaft hole on the front of the differential, and that will allow us to torque down the ring gear bolts to 95 pound-feet of torque. It takes some minor acrobatics to get those bolts torqued up just because of the leverage you need to get the 95 pound-feet of torque. But twist the pinion gear around, get to the next set of bolts, torque the bolts down with your wrench, and then basically rinse and repeat the process until you have all of those ring gear bolts locked down nice and tight.
Now that we have everything torqued down inside the differential, we can actually start putting it back together. We can throw the gasket that we have and then the rear cover plate. And I know probably some of you are thinking, how come you didn't check the backlash between the pinion gear, the big gear that's in the front of the differential, and the ring gear itself, there's a certain mesh or a certain alignment that needs to be set. But since we did not touch the pinion gear and everything else stayed the same, the OS Giken team, as well as some friends of mine that have done diffs before, have mentioned you do not need to actually do anything in regards to setting the backlash with the pinion and the ring gear. So we are good to go. Everything is set. We're gonna put it back together and then get it reinstalled back into the car.
Everything goes back together in reverse order that it came out. Pretty straightforward. Get your axles in. Have your helper jack the differential up as you're getting things put into place. Reinstall the bolts that hold the differential pumpkin housing up into the subframe. Reinstall your drive shaft bolts, which will be torqued down to 55 foot-pounds of torque. The two vertical bolts that hold the diff housing in place, you'll torque down to 70 foot-pounds of torque. The three bolts in the rear that connect the rear of the differential to the subframe, you will torque down to 46 foot-pounds, and then we're just tapping the axles back into place.
All right, we finally got everything buttoned back up. Actually, it wasn't too terribly difficult. Got that drive shaft bolted up, the two mounting bolts for the differential housing, and then the 2 or 3 bolts in the back that are right under here. And then of course the axles, we had to get those in, not too terrible, just tap them in with a screwdriver and a hammer. Now all that we have left to do is fill up the differential with some differential fluid. We'll take a look at what we got up on the bench here. For the first few hundred miles or so, we have this Motul competition gear oil. After a few hundred miles in the differential with that fluid, we're gonna empty that out and change it out for the OS Giken OS 250R, which is specific to their clutch style Super Lock LSDs.
Fill the differential fluid up just enough until it starts to drip out of the fill hole. Then go ahead and reinstall the fill plug bolts and torque that down to 36 foot-pounds of torque.
All right, everybody, we are finished. The OS Giken Differential is installed in the 2017 BRZ. Everything went very smooth. No complaints, a little tricky here and there, but otherwise not too terribly difficult. Now the next thing we gotta do is get this thing on the road, drive it a few hundred miles, flush out that initial differential fluid, and then put in the OS Giken specific OS 250R fluid for maximum locking potential. So stick around for more good stuff coming up here real soon. I'm gonna save the review or my impressions of the OS Giken Diff for a race day after we got that fluid flushed and the good stuff in there. So stick around for that. And I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts or comments, like always, please leave them down below. I'd love to hear from you. Stay fast out there. I am checking out. We'll talk to you all next time.